And we have one more award to present, and our final award today on behalf of the board and staff of Virginians for High-Speed Rail is the Dick L. Beatles and James E. Ukrop Lifetime Achievement Award. And this award is named for Richard L. Dick Beatles, who's previously served as president of the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad, and James E. Jim Ukrop, who previously served as the CEO of Ukrop Supermarkets and First Market Bank, as well as the president of the Greater Richmond Chamber of Commerce. So Dick and Jim, together, they were driven by a vision to connect Richmond and Virginia with improved intercity and high-speed rail. Together, they created Virginians for High-Speed Rail. And over the last 2+ decades, their vision and their advocacy has inspired Virginia to become a national leader in the future of passenger rail transportation. So the Beatles Ukrop Award is presented for extraordinary lifetime achievement in rail transportation development. And I'm excited to present the Beatles Ukrop Award to Mr. Wick Moorman. Mr. Moorman is an esteemed American businessman and railroader. He currently consults with Amtrak, where he served until recently without compensation as its president and CEO. And prior to Amtrak, Mr. Moorman served in positions of chairman, president, and CEO of Norfolk Southern Railway until retiring from Norfolk Southern in 2015. While there, Wick Moorman was instrumental in extending Virginia's Amtrak regional trains to Lynchburg, to Norfolk, and to Roanoke. And currently, Mr. Moorman is helping stand up, and he serves on the new Virginia Passenger Rail Authority, an idea first advanced by Dick Beatles over 2 decades ago. So Wick, I'm pleased to present you this award, the Beatles Ukrop Lifetime Achievement Award. We look forward to your remarks, and also reminding our audience that you can send in your questions to Mr. Moorman or any of our guests today, and hopefully we'll have some time to get to them. So now, Mr. Moorman.
Well, thank you so much, Jack. By the way, I loved that picture of me because they took it for a periodical. I was standing at the end of a dilapidated platform up at Washington Station, looking up, and they put the light on me, and it looked like I was happy and the angels were talking to me. I like to see that every chance I get. Thanks very much, everyone. Let me say first and foremost, I'm absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to speak with you today, and I'm particularly honored not only that it's the 25th anniversary meeting, but honored to have received this award because Jim Ukrop and Dick Beatles obviously drove so much of what's happening in Virginia today in terms of rail, and I'm very, very pleased to accept the award. I think the novelty of Zoom has worn off for a lot of us, and I am going to try and work through this. It's the first time I've spoken to a larger group on Zoom. There's some pluses to Zoom. I feel no guilt at all about not wearing a tie, although I did go get a haircut. And while I can't hear the laughter in the audience when I say something that I think is funny, I also can't see when you doze off or decide to leave. So I guess all in, it cuts about the same. I'd like to talk about a couple of things today. First, and really something I do know something about, a little bit about the current state of affairs at Amtrak. Amtrak's such an important partner to Virginia that I think it's useful for all of you to know, at least in my perspective, how things are going on, how things are going up there. And I also am going to indulge myself and go off on a little bit of a rant about something that annoys me enormously every time I read it. And that is the continuing myths and misconceptions about how Amtrak keeps score in terms of its cost and its accounting. I'll then turn to a little bit for a couple of minutes to some of the questions that Jack posed at the beginning and give you what I think are possible outcomes for the post-COVID world, I will tell you, as I've told millions of people in the past, that I have an exceptionally cloudy crystal ball. But I always say that I make up for it with exceptionally keen hindsight. So we'll see how good I am. And if I've been wrong, you'll hear a different story from me in a couple of years. So let's turn to Amtrak. And let me put COVID aside for a minute and tell you that, in my opinion, Amtrak is a good news story. And why do I say that? I say that because today, Amtrak is a well-run company. It's managed by experienced professionals. And that, quite frankly, is not something I could have told you when I first got up there in 2016. Maybe briefly tell you why I went. I had stepped down as CEO of Norfolk Southern and then stepped down as chairman of the board. We'd moved to Charlottesville, where we live now, and we were doing very well. My wife was delighted that I was retired. And then I was approached by the Amtrak board chair, a terrific guy named Tony Kosha, who started to talk to me about this. And eventually, to the amazement, quite frankly, of my friends and the utter disgust and dismay of my wife, I agreed to take on the role. As was mentioned, I actually started off at $1 a year and eventually had to give that up because it turned out it compromised another part of my pension, which was more than $1. So I gave that up. And I gave a pledge to my wife that it was 6 months, categorically 6 months, no longer. So I spent about 15 months up there, the last 5, I guess, as co-CEO with Richard Anderson. And I'll talk a little bit about Richard as we go ahead. So when I went up there, I used to give talks internally and externally that Amtrak is and was in fact chartered to be under DC law a for-profit corporation. And while the for-profit doesn't work in the business model, in the Amtrak business model, or for that matter, in almost any model of transportation when costs are fully loaded, certainly not in rail around the world, that didn't mean that it couldn't be a well-run corporation. And that was my goal going in. I had 2 assignments from the board. First was to start to fix things. And the second was to help find a successor. And I should also tell you, answer the question, why on earth did I go to Amtrak? Well, three basic reasons. The first, I think Amtrak's important. In fact, the last talk I gave to anyone was to an industry group a couple of years ago about why Amtrak should be important to everyone, to the hosts as well as the public. It was received, I think, with some skepticism, but it is important. And I thought it was a way for me to do some public service and try to do something good without going through the process of having to answer the questions about everyone I'd met in the last 25 years and every place I'd been. So that's the noble reason. The second was that when it became known that the CEO position at Amtrak was going to become available, there were a number of people in the industry that said I would be really an ideal candidate. And I started to agree with that, which is not so noble, but I thought, yeah, I'm a good fit. And the third, and probably the most important thing to remember about me, is I am a trained guy. I've had a wonderful career, but I've been fascinated by the railroad since I can remember, since literally I was 2, I guess. And I really thought that it would be an interesting and fun job. And that certainly turned out to be the case. I enjoyed it immensely. So I signed up for 6 months, went up there in September of 2016. And quite frankly, it was something of a mess up there. And I can list all kinds of reasons why. I'll give you an example. I will say first and foremost, though, there were some really good people up there. Some of them were a better fit in other jobs, and we did that. And then some of them needed to go, and they left. But for the most part, excellent people, a lot of whom are still up there today. But the safety program was not good, and it was trending in the wrong direction because Amtrak had implemented a somewhat poorly conceived safety initiative a couple of years before. There were literally millions of dollars being spent on new IT systems. The projects were being poorly managed, and the results, I mean, even when they were implemented, the benefits were uncertain. The engineering program, particularly on the maintenance of the corridor, was not good, not well executed. And this really meant that we weren't making the improvements up there we should have been, and it caused considerable dismay on the part of the states and the commuter agencies who under the PREA Act were going to be and had started to be responsible for paying their share of corridor maintenance. And we had to improve that. They've made lots of decisions in terms of customer-facing things that just really didn't make much sense. The stations were run down. The interiors of the car were kind of old and dingy. They had, for example, cut the carpet cleaning in the cars, including the cars on the regional, to once a year. And it didn't save a lot of money. But anyway, this is a long list. And so there was lots to do. I didn't have much time to figure this out, so I enlisted the help of some colleagues who are also friends who had recently retired from NS to go in and do deep dives on these specific issues. One in particular I'll mention, I don't know if she's listening today, but Deb Butler, who had retired as our Executive Vice President of Planning, Strategic Planning, and our Chief Information Officer, came in to help me get to the bottom of the things around information technology. And I mention her specifically because she's now on the BPRA board, which I also have the privilege of serving on. So anyway, long story, lots of examples. I'll sum it up by saying two things I've told a lot of people. I wondered when I went in how long it would take me to figure out what was going on and try to come up with a plan. And it became clear within a couple of weeks that not only was there low-hanging fruit in terms of those opportunities, there was some fruit rotting on the ground that needed to be taken care of. And along with that, I would say that almost every day I was there for the first 4 or 5 months, I'd be in a meeting and I'd hear about something that was going on. And I'd say, what? So a lot of work to do. What a difference today. We got some stuff started. And as I mentioned, one of my jobs was to recruit a successor who'd be there for the longer term. And we were fortunate beyond anything I would have thought possible in recruiting Richard Anderson. Richard, whom as I'm sure some of you know, had retired from Delta Airlines about the same time I retired from NS. He had taken Delta from bankruptcy to the most admired domestic carrier, and he was the ideal guy to come into Amtrak in many respects. Richard is truly a change agent. He's very high energy, he's relentless, he's impatient, and to use a phrase that I used a lot up there, he knows what good looks like. The second thing is that he was totally focused on customer-facing issues, particularly in terms of things that have been neglected, things like the carpet, things like bathrooms in the stations and on the trains, just the total environment. I can tell you, when I walked around Washington Union Station with him and saw how he compared it to Terminal 5 in Atlanta, it was an education for me. And then third, and this was really important, I'm a railroad guy. I knew how to run the railroad or what a well-run railroad looks like. But what I didn't understand was the retail passenger marketing environment. And that's what airlines are. They're retail passenger marketing companies on a scale far greater than Amtrak. So he knew that environment, and not only that, he knew the people to bring in to help professionalize that at Amtrak and bring a whole new level of sophistication to pricing and marketing. Now, he and Bill Flynn, the new CEO up there, who also came out of the airline industry, have been castigated and sometimes sneered at by certain people as being airline people. But I will tell you, it is what Amtrak needed and still needs. And they also have brought the right degree of management professionalism in. So I could go on about that. I would tell you, Richard will be the first to admit that he's not perfect. He can be a little impatient, but the difference in Amtrak now and 2016 is just striking. And really with Bill Flynn in there as CEO, I'm very confident that all of that improvement will continue. And I would say, by the way, about Bill, that while he spent most of his career in the airline business, he spent some summers working on a track game when he was a youth. His father worked for a railroad. And he later spent some time at CSX. And now I'm a former track guy myself. So that first thing is a great recommendation. But as a former NS employee, I would say the CS experience is good, but not as good as it could be. So Amtrak is positioned to succeed. Let me talk now, by way of a short rant, about this whole issue around Amtrak's accounting and finances, because any of you who read either Railway Age editorials or Trains Magazine, they are continuing sources of erroneous speculation and misconception about Amtrak's accounting. And this is driven, and I say this with all the love in the world for them, because I like to ride trains too, almost exclusively by the advocates for the long distance network. And it popped up again in the most recent issue of Trains Magazine, where there's an article that purports to show that the idea of cutting back long distance service temporarily because it's bleeding money right now is in fact driven by ideology rather than economics, and it's some kind of attempt to kill off the long distance network. There is an editorial, I think it's out already, coming from Tony Kosha, the Amtrak's board chair, in Railway Age, which answers that very eloquently. I will also say it is not Amtrak's intention to leave any long distance train that was daily before in a tri-weekly mode. They want to bring them all back. They understand their importance in a lot of ways. But as I say, right now, they are losing so much money that they're jeopardizing some other important Amtrak initiatives for the long term. So what else goes on? Well, people espouse that somehow or another Amtrak's cost system doesn't work, and that really long distance trains don't lose any money, and maybe they're really money makers. That's not true. Amtrak uses what network accounting principles. That they're standard for any large business which has distributed network assets on which a lot of businesses ride. Examples are not only the railroads, but the airlines and the telecom companies, the same concept. And the essence of all these systems that you allocate all of the costs in the businesses, including all of the network costs, to the various businesses. And the costs are allocated in three basic ways. Direct variable costs, which Amtrak calls frequency variable costs. The expense of actually running the train, right? Wages for crew, onboard services, fuel costs, the payments to the host railroad, an average cost per each locomotive and car, anything that can be assigned to the train on that given day. Then there are what Amtrak calls the route variable costs, which are still tied just purely to the operation, but are harder to distribute on a daily basis. A couple of examples, a cost center. Another example, all the overhead at the car and locomotive shops. And then finally, there are the fixed costs, although in business you're taught there's no really such thing as a fixed cost because all costs can get cut eventually. But think G&A, think a law department, the accounting department, whatever. And the whole trick of this is to get the allocations right, you know, to make sure that the right costs are going to the right business and even to the right train, not daily, but the right train operation for a year. Amtrak's system was not designed by Amtrak. It was designed by an independent group, consulting group, the Volpe Center, under contract to the FRA. It is a very complex system. In fact, the argument against it is not that it's wrong. It really grinds down into the details. And it goes to great lengths to assume that the costs are calculated appropriately, consolidated appropriately, and then allocated according to the most appropriate metric. And there are a host of metrics, right? Passenger count, train miles, locomotive or car miles, you know, just any way you can think of that's most appropriate to assign that cost. There are occasionally attempts to point out inconsistencies. The classic example is, gee, all of the red caps in Penn Station's costs, or the vast majority of them, I think they said all, are assigned to long distance trains. Well, there may be 5% of the people who are going from New York to Washington or Boston who have a lot of baggage, but it's very unusual. And if that's wrong, the one thing it's not is material. Okay, I'm just about to get off this soapbox, but here are a couple of reasons to believe me. One is, even during my brief tenure as CEO, I had two different CFOs, both in the telecom industry. They looked through the entire system and said, this thing works, it's right. And just as importantly, Amtrak is an outside auditor, E&Y, which is one of accounting's big four firms. They annually verify all of Amtrak's financial statements. And if something were wrong or inappropriate there, they have every incentive not to go along with those statements. So how did all this shake out in 2019? Shifting gears. Well, long distance trains lost a total under this system of $523 million. The Northeast Corridor generated a profit of, I think, about $540 million. That profit under the Amtrak system, and the state-supported services, which include Virginia, lost $90 million, plus or minus. And that's really by design under PREA. And the entire enterprise, and there's some other access businesses and things like that, lost less than $40 million, by the best year they've ever had. Why is that important? That's really important for Amtrak because in addition to those operating losses, they're capital expenditures. And what Amtrak does, and the way to think about it is a cash business, right? There's GAAP reporting, but it's best to think about it as a cash business. So every year, Amtrak takes all the revenues and then all of the state support, all of the infrastructure support from commuter agencies and the government funding that it receives, and it first runs the trains, and then everything else that's left goes into capital, goes into improvements. And they've become more and more efficient at spending capital. At the same time, the losses have gone down. And when they don't have the ability to spend everything on capital that they'd like to, they accumulate funds for big projects. That's how they've been able to buy 75 new locomotives for state and long distance service. That's how they are now looking at replacing the corridor. The new Acellas are testing already, but replacing the regional train equipment and even some of the long distance equipment. These are huge things to do. Everybody who's been on one of the trains and been on the Amfleet ones, they look better than they did a few years ago, but they're old, they're tired. It's long past time for their replacement. So that's how the whole system works. Now, people then who are advocating long distance say, well, yeah, Amtrak makes that money, but look, they spend all this money on capital on the corridor. and long distance doesn't have to spend that. Well, turns out they spend about the same long distance, mostly on equipment and just equipment refurbs and things like that. The corridor service is on that, but a lot of capital now comes from the state. So they spend roughly the same amount of capital. Why am I telling you all of this? Because there's a background noise about Amtrak that continues to go on. And what I'm trying to assure all of you is that it's in the best shape it's been in a long time. It has great plans for the future, and they're a great partner for Virginia and, in fact, for any of the states. So let's talk about Virginia for a minute. I appreciate Secretary Valentine reminding me that I was at an event in 2009. I have trouble remembering events last week these days. But I know I have been with and around the Virginians for high-speed rail and around DRPT folks for a long time right now. And I have always, even in my Norfolk Southern days, held Virginia and the good folks in Virginia out as a model for the way to do business in terms of promoting and implementing passenger rail. In my freight days, I always would say there were 3 issues that had to be surmounted for us, Norfolk Southern, to say, yes, you can run passenger trains on our railroad. First and foremost, we had to address the liability issues. And for that reason, Amtrak, because of Amtrak legislation, that's taken care of. So that was easier. That's easy to do business. Second, we would model the infrastructure, and to the extent that implementing passenger train service caused freight train delay, there had to be capital and a plan to improve capacity to mitigate train delays, both for the freights and for the passengers. And then finally, there needed to be some form of payment for the use of the right-of-way, because we are a privately owned company, but we're owned by our shareholders. There needed to be some payback for that. And Virginia's transportation officials understood that from the start. And the result has been what I think is this remarkable blooming of passenger service, successful passenger service in the Commonwealth. In fact, successful to the point, and this has been mentioned earlier, that I want to say, I think it's still the case, it was when I was there, when the state subsidizes up to a level, any state, the above the rail operating costs that aren't covered by the ticket revenue. And in Virginia, we had trains almost unlike any other state that very quickly covered that cost. And it's a remarkable story. So I applaud and continue to applaud everyone in the Commonwealth for what's happened and what continues to go on. And now, with the new plan, with the construction of the new Potomac River Bridge, this buying the right-of-way and constructing a passenger main down to Richmond, and then the purchase from Doddswell over to Clifton Forge, and all of the opportunities it opens up, Virginia's poised to just go to greater and greater heights. I will tell you, when I first heard about it, I thought that's an audacious plan. I believe that it is. But I think with the implementation of the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority and with the funding sources that have now been lined up, I think it's a plan that's thought out for success. And I am very excited to be part of it. By the way, the plan is really in perfect alignment with the vision of Amtrak management, and my vision as well, as where passenger rail really needs to go in this country. And that is city pairs and a regional focus. I used to ride the train from Charlottesville to Washington in my Amtrak days, back and forth, the regional train. And I rode along with a whole lot of folks who, like me, just really didn't want to ever get on I-95 if they could help it. There are a lot of places in the country where that feeling exists. It's a really powerful vision, and Virginia has shown the success that can come with that vision. So I'll stop rambling here in a minute. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, the post-COVID, post-election world. So let me deal with the post-election world. Well, Amtrak has a fan in the White House, very clearly. One of his campaign videos, I don't know if any of you saw it, really focused on an Amtrak conductor and talking about what a great human being Joe Biden is, and I think he is. My speculation is that Amtrak funding will increase. But let me say, it's important to realize that the anti-Amtrak sentiment, while it's occasionally voiced in Congress, has subsided enormously from the days of John Mica and people like that. And in fact, Amtrak appropriations in the past few years have been pretty healthy. There's been at least 1 year, maybe more, where we actually got more than we asked for initially, which just kind of took us all aback. I think the money to restore long distance service to a weekly basis, it will be coming and coming fairly soon. I think second, and maybe even equal importance, and I think this will be a bellwether, is that we'll start to see real funding and a plan come forward for Amtrak's Gateway project. For those of you who are not familiar with Gateway, it is actually a series of projects to put new tunnels, 2 new tunnels under the Hudson River between Newark and Manhattan, increase capacity to match those tunnels because the old tunnels, which were really compromised by Superstorm Sandy, are still the ones that we're using today, but match that capacity to get from Newark all the way into Penn Station, and ultimately to add some capacity in Penn Station, which is operating at train loads and passenger loads far beyond its design capacity. So that's the single most important Amtrak project. And I'm optimistic that we'll start to see it really move ahead now. I would say that beyond that, beyond those 2 things, there will be increased Amtrak funding, maybe some more on the equipment side. It's unclear to me that when you look at the elements of, I guess, what some of what falls under the Green New Deal, it's a great set of thoughts. It strikes me as having been in the railroad business a long time, that it's would be extraordinarily expensive and very impractical. It's not something any of the freight railroads who actually own the property would welcome. And it's not that it might not happen, or some of it might not happen someday, but I just don't see it with the cost associated with it happening anytime soon. What about post-COVID? Well, Jack asked all the right questions. And I don't know the answers. None of us do. How comfortable will people be traveling in the future? I do think that there will be less business travel. There will be more people who say, I can handle this on a Zoom or WebEx or whatever the technology call is, without having to get on principally an airline to go meet with somebody. There will be more people that work from home, for sure. I'm not sure that it's going to be an overwhelming number, and I think it will. What we're going to see is hybrid models. People that go to the office 2 or 3 days a week and then work from home for the balance of the week. But I'll say this: it's going to be interesting to watch these changes. They're going to have significant effects. But I think in terms of what we want to do here in Virginia, those effects are on the margin. There are still going to be a lot of people who want to travel who don't necessarily go by train today, and a lot of people who, if there is convenient, comfortable train travel, either from city to city or just to commute, there's a lot of appetite for that, because we've just really scratched the surface so far in terms of the potential for rail in the state. I think the future is very bright. Well, thanks for listening to me. Since we're on Zoom and YouTube, I'm going to just now relax and imagine some rapturous applause while Danny does whatever he needs to do to take questions. Danny, have I left any time for questions?
Yeah, I think you have. Danny, we'll go to you first. Wick, thank you so much for your candor, your insights, and what truly has been a lifetime of great achievement in rail transportation. And we deeply appreciate you. Danny, we've got a couple minutes. Do you have some questions?
Two from Rafi Goroyan. I apologize for the last name. Long distance service coming back to daily. Yes, I think so. The problem with long distance, right? There are a number of problems. One is it loses money. And by the way, for those of you who are interested in all of this subject of money and long distance, if you go to the reports section on the Amtrak website and go to frequent FAQs, frequently asked questions, and go to long distance, there's a great white paper which goes through all of this in length, and it's well worth your time. Yeah, Virginia, the problem with it, I think it's coming back to daily. The problem with it from the standpoint of what a lot of Virginians want to do is by the time northbound the train gets up here, it's usually late. It's not reliable, whereas the regionals are very reliable. And I think that's why there's a real opportunity for the second Roanoke train that's in the process of being agreed upon. And did I ever consider, hope, or look into arranging 611 to pull the Roanoke train? I assume most of you know what the 611 is. There was a lot of conversation about that, but it wasn't something that was going to be easy to do, and we didn't do it. And by the time we got to the Roanoke train, I think NS had stopped running it. So, okay, those are my two. Lots for Jennifer up here.
And Jennifer had to jump off to a meeting. Jack and I are tag teaming, so I will close out. But I have one last question for you, Wick. Do you think that the partnership with Virginia and CSX that led to the big landmark deal, if that is successful, do you think Norfolk Southern or the other host railroads might follow suit in those type of capacity or right-of-way partnerships?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that I think Norfolk Southern and the state have been able to do good things already in terms of capacity. We certainly did, as I think most of you know, in implementing the Roanoke train, right, with some, we certainly did with respect to VRE just south of Manassas. And I think there will always be a willingness to work together. I don't, Amtrak's, Norfolk Southern's freight volumes aren't as high as the RF&P coming into Northern Virginia. And there's a fair amount of double track all the way. So it's not clear to me at what point the modeling would ever say, gee, you need a third main track. It might say you need to restore some more double track. Whereas I think with the amount of service that's contemplated for Richmond and the amount of traffic that's on the RF&P, which is, I think, mostly, maybe all double track today, I think the third main is something that has to be done. I don't know that on NS that's anywhere close in terms of traffic density.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Wick, and congratulations on the Beatles U-Crop Award. and for your service on the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority. We look forward to working with you over the coming years and your work on that organization.
Thank you, Dan.